In our lessons from the March 1989 storm, we saw a lot of important impacts at intensities that ranged about 300 to 500 nanotesla per minute. If we look at just over about the last 30 years, there have been at least 3 occasions where intensities of greater than 2,000 nanotesla per minute have been observed at latitudes of concern for the U.S. power grid. So this generally falls into a 1 in 10 year sort of worldwide probability. And if we reduce that down to the North American continent, it becomes a 1 in 30 year sort of probability. This is fully 4 to 5 times larger than what caused a lot of the problems in the U.S. during the March 1989 storm. If we look at even larger and more historic storms, the largest storm that we know of in the 20th century was a storm that occurred in 1921. We were able to determine that that particular storm produced an intensity that was 5,000 nanotesla per minute, fully 10 times larger than this March 1989 storm. As a result, power grid operators have generally been developing procedures based on that 1989 storm, and these are woefully inadequate. They should be expecting storms that are likely 4 to 10 times more intense. If we look at this 1989 storm here again, this was at the peak time, and I'm showing you the disturbance region of an eastward electrojet. I was able to put together the same sort of analysis for the 1921 storm, at least map out the boundaries of what that would look like. And the white outline here that I've overlaid on this 1989 storm show you the potential boundaries of the very enhanced eastward electrojet for that 1921 storm. This is a new awareness of the extremes of severe geomagnetic storms. We did not know of this until the work started by the EMP Commission and followed on subsequently with FEMA and national academies was done. The current design practices are such that we really need to look at this as a systemic risk that the power industry has placed on society. There has been an unrecognized risk. There's no design code to minimize this threat, and we are just getting to the point of really trying to figure out how to remedially deal with this problem. The space weather community themselves have unfortunately dumbed down our understanding of the extremes of the environment, primarily by using things like K indices that saturate at very low thresholds. So there are K9 storms that are at this level, and then the 1921 storm is also a K9 storm, but at a whole different level of intensity when you start talking about it in terms of nanotesla per minute. We did develop detailed models of the power grid, so we have the ability to simulate such a storm on today's infrastructure, because arguably there was no power grid infrastructure in 1921, 1859, or any of these other large storms. So this is a very pressing question that we wanted to do. We also use the same model to give us estimates for a large EMP event as well, because we can use this model for the E3 portion of EMP. Unfortunately, the U.S. power grid is the world's largest at these very high voltages, which are the most vulnerable parts of the network. I mentioned earlier, cycle 19 was one of the largest sunspot cycles on record, yet it was only until cycle 22 that the first power grid collapse occurred during a storm there. Over those intervening years, what has happened is that the power grid has grown about a factor of 10 over several decades. Now there are some initiatives being discussed for developing a supergrid in order to harvest wind energy resources and so forth. That unfortunately would be a trend that would escalate our vulnerability, maybe another factor of 6 or 7 as well. So there is no end in sight for increasing vulnerability if we continue to design the grid in the same way it has been in the past. We also did some estimates here on the areas of probable blackout. Now, I've outlined in black the regions of probable power system collapse that would occur. The red and green dots are the intensity of the geomagnetic induced currents through transformers at each one of these locations on that map. And it is those that determine for us how many of these transformers are at risk of permanent damage. And as we look at that, we see some scenarios here that are very troubling. For example, New Jersey, under this particular scenario, would lose 80% of its transmission network. Pennsylvania, 50% or more. New York State, over 30% of its capability. And this is not necessarily the worst case scenario for any of those states shown on here. You know, it's a matter of positioning it higher and lower latitudes and so forth. We ran many, many scenarios, and this is just one. We estimated that there was in excess of 300 large EHV transformers that would have sufficient GIC exposure to be considered at risk of permanent damage and loss. The replacement time in today's manufacturing market likely would exceed 4 years, maybe up to 10 years, and really place a scenario where perhaps the U.S. economy may not be able to recover fully. Just to give you some perspective, the Northeast blackout that occurred in August 2003, Department of Energy estimated that that cost the country about $10 billion for typically a 1 to 2 day shutdown of the regions impacted by that in lost production and so forth. Hurricane Katrina is the largest natural disaster to have occurred in the U.S. That is about $125 billion sort of impact. From a severe geomagnetic storm scenario, the economic models indicate that the cost in the first year alone would be in the range of about $1 to $2 trillion. So it could easily be the largest natural disaster that we could face. You're looking at something that's an extremely large footprint. There are relatively simple, off-the-shelf strategies that can be employed to greatly reduce our vulnerability. The simplest and most efficient means is putting in resistors in the neutral to ground connection on these transformers. We estimated that simple neutral resistors alone could reduce GIC levels 60 to 70%. And there certainly are other strategies that can be coupled with that to provide even further benefits.